CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Juliet Mann.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. UN nuclear experts arrive at the Zaporizhzhia power plant in Ukraine as renewed shelling threatens to disrupt the trip.
EU states meet their storage targets for gas 2 months ahead of schedule. But is energy security guaranteed for this winter?
Go nuclear and go large and go with Sizewell C.
Outgoing UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson pledges $800 million for a new nuclear power plant in a bid to safeguard the country's power supplies.
Beijing accuses Washington of a technology blockade after 2 of America's top chip makers are ordered to stop selling AI chips to China. And
I'm here at Austria's largest glacier, which is melting at a record speed amid a summer of soaring temperatures.
A team of United Nations inspectors has arrived at Europe's biggest nuclear power plant after the trip had looked likely to be called off due to renewed violence.
The experts are trying to assess safety standards at the Zaporizhzhia plant in Ukraine after weeks of fighting around the site. Ukraine has blamed Russia for attacks in the area, but Moscow says Ukrainian saboteurs are behind the clashes. Well, our correspondent Sergio Olmas is in Zaporizhzhia. Sergio, what's the latest on that UN convoy now?
Well, if you see this road behind me right here, this is the road where that UN convoy will have to pass through when they return to Zaporizhzhia. We are hearing that the agency's chief, Rafael Grossi, is on his way with some members of the team. Behind me, you'll see that we're awaiting their arrival, which we hear is imminent. Some of the team, from what we're told, may stay behind there, establish a presence until September 3rd as they work out a longer-term presence there. Again, this is initial reporting from what we're hearing. We will update that as we learn more. But Rafael Grossi this morning set out from Zaporizhzhia, donning, some of the team had donned body armor in that long convoy into Russian-held territory as there were explosions reported. There was military activity in Ohad. They set out to try to get some answers about what's happening inside that nuclear power plant.
We know that there is an area, as you know, the so-called gray zone, where the last line of the Ukrainian defense comes, and before the first line of the Russian occupying forces begin, where the risks are significant. At the same time, we consider that we have the minimum conditions to move, accepting that the risks are very, very high.
Well, we'd heard that this inspection was in peril because of renewed fighting in the area. What are both Ukraine and Russia saying about who's responsible for the latest shelling?
Well, Ukraine is saying that Russia is staging a provocation ahead of the IAEA's visit, that there was even shelling along the route, disrupting their trip there. We heard from Ukraine's energy minister saying that Ukraine cannot guarantee the safety of the team because as they head into Russian-occupied territory, they don't have, the ability to guarantee their safety there. Russia is saying that Ukraine tried to mount an amphibious assault today, sending in 60 troops to try to retake the plant before inspectors arrive. We know that Ukraine has been calling for that area to be demilitarized. Russia has so far rejected those appeals. Let's hear a little bit from Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister.
We're doing everything to ensure that this power station is safe, that it functions safely, and for the IAEA mission to carry out all its plans. They say that they're not in a position to say who is in the wrong. Of course, they should be shown all those traces left as a result of Ukrainian shelling. We have insisted that the mission must include experts in ballistics, so I hope we're going to find out more.
Sergio, what about people living nearby? How are they dealing with the threat of more attacks?
Well, we know that there's been an update to the air raid sirens to include the threat of radiation. It sounds differently than like an air raid siren for bombs. We know that iodine tablets have been started to get passed out. Local officials have been starting to pass those out because of the threat of radiation from the nuclear power plant. We know the state energy company puts out daily advisories on where radiation would, the areas that would be affected according to weather patterns every day. We know that if you see behind me, this is clearly a country at war. We're less than 35 miles from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. This area gets, the city rather, gets shelled pretty consistently. Explosions have been heard every night that I've been here for the past couple weeks. That being said, people are people and they're trying to live their lives. I've seen more weddings in the past 2 weeks than I have in the last 6 months. If you go to coffee shops now, they're packed and people are taking a night stroll, a stroll through the summer night, and there's kids playing, just a few kilometers from where I'm standing.
Sergio Olmos in Zaporizhzhia, thank you.
Well, let's talk now to Shola Talabi, who's Adjunct Professor of Nuclear Engineering and Radiological Sciences at the University of Michigan. Welcome back to the programme, Shola. So, as we've been hearing there, inspectors have now been to the plant. What do you think they've been looking for, and what will they be worried about?
Right, thank you. So they're looking for signs of degradation of overall plant safety, and obviously signs of damage, especially for the infrastructure outside the nuclear containment building where the reactor and some of the critical components are. But there are a lot of components and critical equipment outside the plant that are required to maintain the core function of cooling. So you have water intake systems that could have been damaged from the shelling, or maybe even could be blocked due to debris from the shelling. So they're going to be looking at some of those systems to ensure that, at least to try to assess what the level of degradation and damage could be to overall plant safety.
So you say that some of the systems are outside. We've heard that shelling has been intensifying around the plant. Just how dangerous is the situation there right now, do you think?
It continues to be very dangerous because again, these critical components outside the reactor are required to keep the reactor cool. So you have the electrical systems that supply power to operate things like reactor coolant pumps. You have also dry cask storage, which is spent fuel, so fuel that's already been used in the plant that's stored outside in these dry casks. If those are impacted, you could have what's equivalent to what's called a dirty bomb, where you have radionuclide particles that are spread into the atmosphere from the impact of a blast. And so, again, these plants are not designed to be under this type of military assault, and demilitarizing the plant is critical.
So we also heard that the inspectors are hoping to maintain a presence there. What can they do going forward to try and keep this plant safe?
Right, so they can continue to assess these potentially degraded systems, and also maybe even have a chance to interact with the plant workers. So again, when we think about nuclear plant safety, there are these 3 Ps that we try to keep in mind. That's the people, the physical facility, and the processes. And so the longer they're there, the more they can assess, the stress that these 3 Ps are under, because the people are certainly working under duress. The physical facility is being shelled, so that is under stress. And the processes, especially the processes, these plants are highly procedural. Things have to work in sequence, and they will be able to assess, just how well the systems are working. And so I think it is a great idea. If it's possible for them to maintain a presence at the plant, that would be very, very beneficial.
Okay, Shola Talabi from the University of Michigan. Great to get your thoughts today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Hungary says it will get a major boost in gas supplies ahead of the winter after reaching an agreement with Moscow.
But for many other EU countries, gas flows through the Nord Stream 1 pipeline have been halted, with Russia citing maintenance issues.
Our correspondent Trent Murray reports from Budapest.
Well, Hungary's appetite for Russian gas shows little sign of abating any time soon. The government here has signed yet another deal with Gazprom for additional shipments starting immediately. The Foreign Minister, Peter Seattle, announced that he had signed the deal with the state-owned Russian company for them to provide up to 5.8 million cubic metres of additional natural gas each day over the course of September and October. It's all coming via pipelines from Serbia. Those supplies come on top of existing agreements. Budapest and Moscow inking a major deal last year for Russia to provide Hungary with 4.8 billion cubic metres of gas per year as part of a 15-year agreement. With this fresh injection of gas into the pipelines, the Foreign Minister says supplies are now assured.
The goal of the Hungarian government is to achieve full energy supply security, to be sure that in this coming winter or any time after, people in Hungary won't find themselves in an undignified situation where they can't keep warm, use hot water or cook.
But what's happening here in Hungary is in stark contrast with the rest of the European Union, as countries like Germany and France scramble to find alternatives following the war in Ukraine and Gazprom's decision to throttle supplies on Nord Stream 1. This fresh announcement from the Orbán government is likely to raise some eyebrows across Europe. Critics within the EU remain concerned over Hungary's increased business dealings with the Kremlin, given Russia's military aggression over the border in Ukraine. Trent Murray, CGTN, Budapest.
The European Commission is looking into options to cap energy prices as part of proposals to tackle spiralling costs. Gas prices have hit record highs since the war in Ukraine with Russia, slashing deliveries.
Europe's energy crisis could be showing signs of easing as EU states fill their gas reserves faster than expected. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Alex Cadier, who's in Brussels. So, Alex, what options are the EU considering?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. The main priority was going to be to keep costs down for households across the continent. Now, the key is also to reduce their reliance on Russian fossil fuels. As you said, since the invasion of Ukraine, that's not been a reliable source of energy for the European Union, possibly, as we heard in Trent Murray's report, with the exception of Hungary, which is a bit of an outlier on this particular issue. Moscow has said that the cut-offs to gas supply to Western Europe have been because of maintenance issues, but Paris and Berlin, among others, accusing Moscow of weaponizing their energy supply in retaliation for European sanctions over Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, in the last week alone, Gazprom has cut supply to France and to Germany, and so on the one hand, Europe will be very keen to diversify their energy sources and get more energy sources in the hope of keeping costs down. And that can mean turning to other fossil fuels or other sources of energy like coal or nuclear. We know that some coal power plants in Germany and Austria have been reopened and their lives extended in the hope of kind of dealing with the crisis through other fossil fuels. Now, they're also looking at some fairly serious market reforms. A price cap across the European Union has been called for by some countries, and also decoupling the price of gas and electricity is one method to make electricity be a little bit cheaper and not too reliant and linked to the cost of gas, but also allowing cheaper energy sources like solar or wind to be sold at cheaper prices. At the moment, they are fixed to the slightly more expensive sources of energy like gas and oil. So fundamental market reforms there. Really, the main thing they will do, the main thing they're looking at, though, is reducing gas consumption. That's a target of a 15% reduction until March of next year across the European Union, very much to not be too reliant on Russian fossil fuels and on Russian gas. And that can mean a number of energy-saving measures like air conditioning limits that we've seen deployed in places like Spain, because analysts say that the most effective way to weather the winter energy crisis will be a reduction of gas consumption.
But, Alex, a longer-term concern about supplies perhaps easing because the bloc's already reached its gas storage targets 2 months ahead of schedule.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The European Union had set itself the target of having an 80% capacity, their gas reserves filled at 80% capacity by November. Well, it's the 1st of September today, and they've reached that target already. Now, these reserves are by no means a silver bullet. It's not the end of the road for the energy crisis in Europe. The reserves at 80% capacity would supply Europe with gas for about 3 months, so it's very much an emergency safety net. Some countries, Poland, Portugal, for example, have reached 100% capacity. The little caveat there is that the storage capacities will differ quite drastically between European countries. Germany has 80 times more storage space than Portugal, for example. 6 other countries are going to reach the 80% target in November, so that's also looking good for them, which means by that point half of the European Union will have reached the target either early or on time. So as I said, that safety net will certainly be quite important. Some countries lagging behind, Bulgaria just shy of the target, and Latvia only hitting 55%, meaning quite a road to go to get to the 80% mark by November. Interestingly, 9 countries, Finland, Ireland and Greece among them, don't have any gas storage capacity at all. So they have what they call solidarity agreements with other European nations. Now, another reason why the safety net matters so much is that Europe has had some problems with its domestic supply. French nuclear power stations, for example, running at reduced capacity, half capacity at some points in the summer because of technical difficulties and water levels in the Rhine, for example, making coal deliveries to those coal power plants I mentioned even more difficult with barges running with very low cargo loads indeed. So although this certainly doesn't spell the end of the energy crisis for Europe, it does mean it has a safety net to get through difficult months.
Alex, thank you very much. That's our correspondent, Alex Cadier, in Brussels.
Well, let's talk to Song Changlong, who's senior analyst at global energy research firm Rystad Energy. And thanks so much for coming on the show. So, full gas storage doesn't solve the energy problems across Europe. And it doesn't mean that Germany, for example, is going to make it through the winter, does it?
Speaking of, thank you for having me. Well, speaking of Germany, I would say so far Germany has already done a great job there in their storage target. So far, the current German storage level had already reached about 84%, and also the government are taking several measures to try to reduce the gas demand and also save gas. For example, they were trying to cut the gas use by reducing the heating in the public buildings and also shutting off the lights during the night. So, and also they have more ambitious storage target for the next months. So for the coming winter, we still have some uncertainties about the Russian gas supply, but I think the Germany is doing whatever they can to build up their storage.
So we heard there from our correspondent that this is a safety net in terms of getting that full gas storage. But last week we heard that China is selling its surplus of LNG to Europe. Does that help much?
Well, yes, it would help indeed, because considering the tightness of the European gas market, and based on our latest monitor about the global LNG trades, as one of the major LNG importer in Asia, China only imports about 4.7 million tons of LNG for the past 8 months of this year, which is 25% lower than the same period of last year. So China is not competing directly with the European buyers for the spot volumes, because the majority of the imported LNG were contract volumes. So instead, China now they partially selling its surplus to Europe. It will definitely help Europe build up their storage to some degree, because now China has a relatively healthier inventory than Europe.
Well, businesses are being urged to cut their energy use as a precaution. I mean, what do you think? How likely will we see energy rationing across Europe this winter?
Well, as you may notice, nowadays many discussions were surrounding whether Europe will introduce a price cap on electricity market, and also do what the Spanish government did a little bit during the summer. They introduced a price cap for their domestic gas market. So for the rationing plan, I think it's still worthy discussion, because we are still faced with the uncertainties of the Russian gas supplies for the coming winter, and we also need to import more LNG from US and also from other regions. So among all these factors, I think it's necessary to discuss the rationing plan.
Song Changlong, pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Still ahead here on CGTN. Last orders. How UK pubs face a fight for survival on the back of the energy crisis.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? grey rhinos, and unicorn companies. Make sense of it all with global business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann. CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. And in the UK, we're available 24 hours a day on Freeview.
Beijing has voiced strong opposition to a report by the United Nations Human Rights Chief on the treatment of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang.
Issuing a report just ahead of her departure from the post, Michelle Bachelet said China has committed serious human rights violations against the minority and said credible reports of mistreatment could amount to crimes against humanity.
Beijing has rejected the findings, describing them as invalid.
The so-called critical report you mentioned was planned and manufactured firsthand by the U.S. and Western forces. It is wholly illegal and invalid. The report is a hodgepodge of misinformation, and it's a political tool used as part of the West's strategy of using Xinjiang to contain China. It seriously violates the principles of universality, objectivity, non-selectivity, and non-politicization.
The US government is temporarily allowing American chipmaker Nvidia to continue with exports, which are needed to develop its flagship artificial intelligence chip.
Comes a day after the company says it was ordered by Washington to stop shipments of two kinds of chips to China. Beijing accused the US of attempting a technological blockade. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Caroline Malone, who's in Washington, D.C. for us. Good to see you, Caroline. What more do we know?
Well, basically, a couple of high-tech chip makers are saying that the US government's recent license requirements effectively mean that they won't be able to sell some of their products to China. You mentioned there Nvidia. Well, they said on Wednesday that the export ban effectively impacts a number of their high-tech chips, such as the A100 and the H100 chips, and also a flagship chip that's in development at the moment. The specific AI chips really help to speed up machine learning tasks, so important in that area. A Silicon Valley firm, AMD, has also said that the restrictions will affect some of their chip products. It all comes from a filing from the US Security and Exchange Commission dated from August 26th that says the requirement is on any future export to China and Russia in order to address the risk that the covered products may be used in or diverted to a military end use.
And what about the impact on the two companies? What will this move to the order by Washington to stop the shipments to China? What effect is that going to have on business?
Well, absolutely. Absolutely. Nvidia is saying that they see this restriction actually affecting around $400 million in sales to China in this quarter if customers do not want to purchase the company's alternative product offerings, or if the US government doesn't grant licenses in a timely manner or denies licenses to those customers. And it may also mean that that company has to transition certain operations out of China. AMD, on the other hand, said the restrictions will affect its MI250 artificial intelligence chips from being exported to China, but it doesn't think that its other chips will be affected, and therefore the policy is unlikely to have a really material impact on its business. But overall, it does mean that some Chinese businesses will not be able to conduct cost-effective advanced computing without the chips that we're talking about here. That includes for things such as image and speech recognition that are used in smartphones and also in satellite imagery for weapons. It's really part of a wider attempt here by the US really to fix the impact of future supply chain disruptions while also increasing competition with China. And to that end, a US Commerce Department spokesperson has said it's taking a comprehensive approach to implement additional actions necessary related to technologies, end uses and end users to protect US national security and foreign policy interests.
Caroline Malone in Washington, D.C. Thanks for that.
Well, let's explore this further with Naeem Aslam, who's Chief Market Analyst at AvaTrade. Good to have you with us. So what effect do you think this move will have on NVIDIA and other US chip producers?
Sure. Thanks for having me. Look, I think the move is coming at a very, very wrong time. It's coming when everyone is very much in battle with inflation. So these moves are only going to increase prices. But something which was discussed earlier on your show, your correspondence was speaking about. Look, when it comes to use or any of those military weapons, we don't that China is very much relying on American technology. They're using their own technology. In fact, the US is very much concerned how Chinese chips are deployed through CCTV cameras or through various different surveillance systems within the United States, and they're trying to ban that. For example, one of the major surveillance company in the United Kingdom is very much on the verge of just being banned because of those chips which are coming from China. So in terms of the companies, I think the move is certainly not in the right direction, because during Trump administration, the agenda was that look, we're creating more friction that is only going to create more higher prices and have more frictions between the two largest economies in the world. So overall, investors are worried about that. And then that is the reason that we're seeing this hefty losses in terms of these chip makers or the semiconductors in the US market today.
So what effect do you think this will have on prices if these chips, which are used in so many things, are less widely available?
Well, I think from nationalism perspective, China is definitely on the right step. It is already producing the same sort of chips at a fraction of our prices. So now the competition, if you look at it from the silver lining perspective, the competition is going to become even more intense. So perhaps, I'm being very, very optimistic over here, that we will see another wave of chips, these highly capable good chips which can do all the AI functions at a fraction of the price if China really begins to ramp up its production and its technology on that side. And if that doesn't really happen, given where inflation is, we are only going to see surge in prices for American companies.
So how important do you think China is as a trading partner for US chip makers?
Looking at the numbers, 400 million when the revenue was about 1.59 billion for the quarter. So obviously the number states itself how important China is for these particular companies. But on a global scale, I do not think that is going to have a major material impact on that. Because remember, this chip war started a while back, and companies are already looking at these particulars. But here is something really important for investors to pay attention to. I think there would be different jurisdictions established for companies like NVIDIA, AMD, through which they can still maneuver those chips to China. China will still be able to buy them, or the Chinese company will still be able to buy them. But I think Chinese authorities are going to encourage and going to place new restrictions through which the companies based in China must use chips produced in China.
Okay, Naeem Aslam from AvaTrade. Great to get your thoughts today. Thank you.
The jobless rate in the Eurozone hit a record low in July. The number of people seeking employment across the bloc fell to 6.6%, or around 11 million people. Economists say a strengthening labour market and risk that wages will rise sharply could push the European Central Bank to increase interest rates in coming months.
The pound has seen its biggest monthly fall against the dollar in 5 years. Sterling was trading at $1.16 earlier and shed 5% of its value overall in August. Concerns over the rising cost of living and the energy crisis have been blamed for the drop in spending and consumer confidence in the UK.
Sri Lanka has reached a provisional agreement on a bailout for its economic crisis. The International Monetary Fund says terms have been approved for a $2.9 billion rescue package. But the deal, which has yet to be signed off, will depend on Sri Lanka getting debt relief on existing loans and improving governance standards.
Germany's national airline Lufthansa says it will have to cancel 800 flights on Friday after the pilots' union announced a strike. The 24-hour walkouts will begin just after midnight on Thursday after pay talks failed. It's likely to affect 130,000 passengers at Frankfurt and Munich airports, as well as cargo services.
Still ahead on Global Business Europe, letting the train take the financial strain, why passengers in Spain are expected to get on board.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London. China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Juliet Mann and Robin Dwyer. The headlines again. UN nuclear experts arrive at the Zaporizhia power plant in Ukraine as renewed shelling threatens to disrupt the trip.
EU states meet their storage targets for gas 2 months ahead of schedule. But is energy security guaranteed for this winter?
And Beijing accuses Washington of a technology blockade after 2 of America's top chip makers are ordered to stop selling AI chips to China.
In one of his final acts as UK Prime Minister before leaving office next week, Boris Johnson has announced an $800 million investment in a new nuclear plant.
The project's being developed on England's eastern coast by French energy company EDF. Johnson says the war in Ukraine, which has pushed up gas prices, has demonstrated the need for new nuclear generation capacity in the UK.
This new reactor is just a part of our Great British nuclear campaign. We will build a reactor a year again. We will build them across the country, at least 8 of them, large ones and small modular reactors. And of course, they're not the entire solution to our energy needs. Far from it. Yes, we are increasing our own domestic hydrocarbons. We've got more gas out of the North Sea this year than last year, considerably more, 26% more. We are putting a big bet, as you know, on hydrogen, on carbon capture and storage.
Well, our correspondent Michael Voss joins us in the studio now. How important is this announcement that Boris Johnson's made? And is it going to make a difference to consumers like you and me and our bills this year?
Well, as you said, this is his last major policy announcement, and it still has to be ratified and pushed through by his successor. So let's see about this. Now, it is incredibly expensive. It's going to come to about $30 billion, take 10 years to build, and will provide about 7% of the country's energy needs. Now, Boris Johnson sees this as doing 2 things. One, it increases the country's energy security, if you like, reducing our need for foreign gas. At the same time, it's reducing our use of fossil fuels, which will help the country meet its 2050 target of being carbon neutral. The difficulty is, critics say this is doing nothing to ease the immediate impact of the current energy crisis that is going to force millions of people into fuel poverty as winter approaches. They also point out that nuclear energy, the cost of generating nuclear energy, is much higher than that of wind and solar power. So already there's calls for whoever comes next to review the policy and to concentrate instead on quicker, cheaper renewables and insulation.
So in just a few days' time, the UK will have a new Prime Minister. How worried should they be about the energy crisis that's going to hit them when they take office next week?
Well, I think whoever comes in next week, this is going to be the top item on their in-tray. People up and down the country are really worried about how they're going to pay their energy bills and the cost of living crisis that is coming. Also, there's considerable pressure from within the ruling Conservative Party for some strong, immediate action, amid fears that if they get it wrong, it could cost them the next election.
What do we want? Decent pay! When do we want it? Now!
It's been a summer of discontent with labour disputes breaking out across Britain. Rail strikes, postal workers, dockers, and even barristers have been staging strikes as the cost of living crisis hits with rampant inflation and soaring energy costs. And with fuel bills set to rise by another 80% in October, Labour leaders are warning of more strikes to follow and a winter of discontent. It's starting to attract international attention. On Wednesday night, the left-wing US Senator Bernie Sanders received a standing ovation at a transport workers' rally in London.
We are living in a time when we are seeing extraordinary wealth being produced, but it is going to a handful of people. We are living at a time when we are seeing increased pain and suffering for working families. Our job right now, internationally, is to stand together. Our job right now is to bring people all over the world together.
But it isn't just workers and their families hit by the cost of living crisis. The fuel caps, which limit price increases, only apply to domestic bills. There's no support for businesses.
The hospitality industry was badly hit during the COVID pandemic. Now there are warnings that thousands of pubs could close unless the government steps in.
Many pubs struggled to survive the COVID lockdowns. Now, as well as fuel bills, brewers are also facing rising raw material costs.
This site here in North London, our electricity loan's gone from £16,000 a year to £65,000 a year. We signed that deal 10 days ago, and already that looks like, frankly, a bargain, which sounds so, it's so ridiculous, frankly, but that's just the situation we're in. 70% of licensees or publicans aren't going to make it through the winter unless something's done on prices.
Pubs are just one of many sectors wondering how to cope. Part of the difficulty is that there's no indication of what the government plans to do. The prolonged leadership contest to replace Boris Johnson as Prime Minister has put all policy initiatives on hold. Everyone's now waiting to see what the country's next leader can offer when they take power next week, as millions of households and businesses face unaffordable energy bills.
Pubs are just one of many examples of small and large industries that could go under. Also, you've got some schools talking about going down to 3-day week to help pay their energy bills, and the National Health Service is wondering about how it's going to find the money to pay for these extra energy costs.
Difficult times ahead. Michael Voss, thank you very much. Short to medium train journeys are now free in many parts of Spain.
The initiative, which runs until the end of the year, is designed to help Spaniards cope with the cost of living crisis and to encourage the use of public transport.
Our correspondent Rahul Pathak reports from Madrid.
Extraordinary measures for extraordinary times. The decision by Spain's government to offer free monthly rail passes has been prompted by a record-high inflation rate that has stretched household budgets to breaking point. The scheme, operated by Spain's state rail company Renfe, has already seen nearly 500,000 people register for tickets, with many more expected.
Now, unfortunately, this doesn't mean you can just hop on any train and travel anywhere you like in Spain for free. It only applies to multi-trip and monthly rail tickets for all short to medium distance journeys, for anything up to 300 kilometres. So single trip and long distance journeys are excluded. But despite that, Renfe say that by the time this scheme comes to an end on December the 31st, it will have resulted in up to 75 million free train journeys.
I think it is a good measure from this government, because inflation is really high due to the war in Ukraine. And for people like me with disabilities, it will be helpful.
I like it because I live outside Madrid, and a round-trip ticket for me was 26 euros. Now it will cost only 20 euros until the end of the year. That's a lot of savings.
Recently, the Spanish government also announced a 30% reduction in the price of all public transport, including metro systems, buses and trams. It's thought the introduction of all this free and subsidised travel will cost the equivalent of $222 million. It's part of an overall €9.5 billion aid package to help Spaniards cope with the drastic increase in the cost of living.
It should help with inflation because transport is about 13% of the index. So, you know, if you get in there and simulate a normal behavior of other prices, you could knock 3 percentage points off inflation year on year, right? So that could be really helpful.
The offer is also being extended to foreign visitors, Spain hoping the expected influx of passengers will help its tourism industry continue its post-pandemic recovery. The first 6 months of 2022 have already seen the sector top its 2019 pre-pandemic levels over the same period. Industry experts are confident the free rail travel initiative will push those levels still further. Rahul Pathak, CGTN, Madrid.
A new fuel subsidy has come into effect in France to help drivers with rising prices.
It builds on a previous one introduced earlier in the year and now sees the state pay for 30 cents of each litre bought. Our correspondent Ross Cullen reports.
Since April, the rate at which the government subsidises petrol prices in France has been 18 cents a litre. As part of new inflation-fighting measures, the new rate will now be 30 cents a litre until the end of October. The Prime Minister said that the state is acting to help the public with what she called an additional measure to support the purchasing power of the French. In July, the government passed new legislation with $44 billion of extra spending to combat soaring inflation and rising energy prices. The new 30 cents a litre subsidy was timed to give a boost to parents by coming into effect to coincide with the start of the new school year. The subsidy is due to drop to 10 cents a litre in November and December. It comes as the country prepares for a tough winter. On Friday, President Macron will chair a crisis meeting with the Prime Minister and the Finance and Energy Secretaries to discuss how France is going to deal with any gas and electricity supply problems later in the year. Russia's energy giant Gazprom has already suspended gas deliveries to France over what's being described as a contractual dispute. Ross Cullen, CGTN, Paris.
The boss of Russia's biggest private oil firm has died. after reportedly falling from a hospital window. Ravil Maganov, chair of Lukoil, had been an outspoken critic of President Putin's war in Ukraine. Russia's Interfax news agency says he sustained fatal injuries in what they describe as an accident at a private clinic in Moscow. But in a statement, Lukoil said he had passed away after a long illness.
Malaysia's former First Lady is facing a decade in jail after being found guilty of corruption charges. 70-year-old Rosmah Mansor had denied receiving bribes in exchange for government contracts. Last month, her husband, former Prime Minister Najib Razak, began a 12-year prison sentence for his role in the multi-billion-dollar investment scandal at the state-backed Malaysia Development Fund.
21 million people in Chengdu, one of the largest cities in southwest China, have been locked down as officials carry out 4 days of mass COVID testing. The city reported over 100 new COVID infections on Wednesday. Essential services like supermarkets, pharmacies and hospitals will remain open.
Poland is facing a severe shortage of teachers as students head back to school for the start of a new academic year. The Polish Teachers Union says there are around 20,000 vacancies, with low pay and education reforms to blame for the shortage. It comes as tens of thousands of Ukrainian refugee children there have registered for school for the first time.
As students in the United States head back to class, some school districts are finding far fewer pupils coming back for the new academic year.
A drop in enrolment is affecting public schools across the country and leading to budget cuts. Our correspondent Mark New reports.
In the San Francisco Unified School District, enrollment has declined by nearly 7% over the past 2 years. It's a problem, especially when public school districts in California receive about $10,000 per student from the state.
Over the last 10 years or so, we've seen enrollment decrease a little bit each year. The impact of declining enrollment on schools means that we don't have the money to support all of the programs that have been there before. We are really focused on making sure all of our schools have the programs or the resources to execute their programs with excellence.
San Francisco Unified School District's enrollment decline could have resulted in a near $36 million loss. But due to the impact of the COVID pandemic, the state of California decided to allow school districts to budget for this year based on attendance from 2019 to 2020 instead. San Francisco is not alone in confronting falling numbers. In New York City, enrollment at the largest public school district in the country has dropped by 50,000 students in the past 2 years.
We are seeing enrollment declines across the country. Some of that is tied to back in 2008 in the Great Recession, birth rates fell. And so the classes as they are coming through are smaller than they had been. We also saw during the Trump administration that immigration was curtailed. And then finally, COVID does have a lasting impact.
Latimer says during the COVID pandemic, which resulted in remote learning, many parents homeschooled their kids or moved them to private schools.
We know that for some, it is that they had childcare needs. They weren't able to provide support during the pandemic in home because families were working. Parents had to go out and find ways to have people who could look after their children. We also know that for some people, it was frustration with policies.
San Francisco Unified School District Enrollment Executive Director Lauren Kohler says another reason for the decline is high property prices forcing families to move to less expensive cities. With large numbers of students who speak Chinese or Spanish, Kohler says her office is improving engagement with the community by providing counselors that speak in 7 different languages.
We also have an enrollment fair coming up in October, and we'll do a lot of neighborhood workshops around the enrollment fair to help families in different neighborhoods understand the enrollment process in their own language, in their own neighborhood school.
Kohler says the district is also looking to boost enrollment by reconsidering its school assignment policy so as to give students more choice to attend the public school that fits them best. Mark New, CGTN, San Francisco.
You're watching CGTN. Still to come. We're in northern Kosovo, where a row with Serbia over car license plates is revving up.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The cleanup operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So now we've actually become the border on this road.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
The economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
The focus is firmly on future technologies.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Welcome back. NATO peacekeepers are patrolling the streets of northern Kosovo to maintain order after it was announced that 500,000 ethnic Serbs in the region would have to switch their car licence plates to local ones within 2 months.
Serbia does not recognise Kosovo's independence, and Serbs in northern Kosovo consider Belgrade as their capital. Our correspondent Aljosha Milenkovic reports.
This is Kosovska Mitrovica, a town divided by the Ibar River and by the 1999 Kosovo War.
The main purpose of the bridges is to connect people. But for decades now, this one has been a symbol of division, serving as a partition of two seemingly irreconcilable communities that share this town.
In the northern Serbian-controlled side of the bridge, Serbian flags are on every light pole. Graffiti images on the walls say, "NATO go home, and this is Serbia." Placards glued around the town also say KM license plates would remain. A massive statue of the 14th century Serbian leader Lazar, who was killed in the Battle of Kosovo in 3089 against the invading army of the Ottoman Empire, points to the south in the main city square. Across the river, in the Albanian-controlled part of the city, a mirror picture of the iconography in the north. This statue with threatening stare toward the opposite side. Also different flags, murals and graffiti. Both sides have been locked in conflict for a while, with opposing expectations about the end result of disputes.
Possibilities for escalation, they exist all the time, especially when you are nearby to close on a deal. So if will have not a deal, it might happen that to have an escalation in order to, because every side wants to make a deal to be much favorable on his side.
According to Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić, 100 countries refused to recognize the independence of Kosovo and Metohija, including Russia, China, India, Spain, and 4 other EU countries. As the Kosovo-Albanian side expects Serbia to accept Kosovo's independence and all of its attributes, Serbs expect their homes to remain in Serbia and their cars to continue displaying Serbian license plates.
The license plates are the most important thing for us. Those are the last attributes of the Serbian state here, beside the education and healthcare systems. It's the KM license plate, and I hope that President Vučić will finally say stop and recognise that he made a mistake by making so many concessions.
Many Serbs in Kosovska Mitrovica are not too happy with the concessions that Belgrade authorities have so far given to Kosovo Albanians. Just as many Kosovo Albanians are unhappy with their unresolved status. Aljosha Milenkovic, CGTN, Kosovska Mitrovica.
Southern Pakistan is braced for more flooding as a surge of water flows down the Indus River.
It's expected to compound the devastation already caused by weeks of abnormally heavy monsoon rains and melting glaciers. Nearly 1,200 people are known to have been killed, including almost 400 children. The World Health Organization says over 6 million people are in dire need of humanitarian aid.
UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has called for urgent and collective action, appealing for $160 million in aid.
Heat waves are causing glaciers in Europe to experience their most severe melting on record, even before the end of summer.
Glacier ski resorts in the Alps were forced to close early, and drinking water supplies and hydropower operations have also been affected by the melting ice.
Our correspondent Johannes Pleshberger reports.
Some years ago, the Basterze, Austria's largest glacier, was an ice giant. Now the meltwater is flowing non-stop down into the valley. This year's heat waves have accelerated the demise of Austria's alpine landmark.
50 years ago, the glacier was up here, and now it's down there.
Josef Rieger has been operating the glacier cableway for the past 37 years. And every year he had to extend the footpath from the cableway to the receding ice by dozens of meters. Today, however, the meltwater streams make the trail impassable for tourists.
This year, the melt is worse than usual. The cracks in the ice are getting bigger and bigger, and the glacier is about to break in two parts in the centre. You can also see how the meltwater lake is getting much wider and deeper.
Glaciologists confirm Josef's observations. Since the beginning of record-keeping, glacial retreat has never been as significant as it has been in these past summer months, both in Austria and Switzerland. Precise measurement reports, however, will not be published until September.
The fact that the glacier is melting at a quicker rate is not only due to the heat. Normally this ice is covered in a protective layer of snow, but this spring was different. Instead, the wind blew in dust from the Sahara, which intensified the heat of the sun.
With or without Sahara dust, the days of the alpine glaciers are numbered. According to the United Nations, Austria will be ice-free by the end of the century. By then, cows, which already graze at altitudes that were previously unthinkable, are going to find grass on the former glacier, as they did about 3,000 years ago, during the last warm period. Johannes Pleshberger, CGTN, Basterze, Austria.
Astronauts from China's Shenzhou 14 have begun the first spacewalk of their 6-month mission.
The crew used the airlock cabin of the Wentian Lab module as they left the Tiangong space station. The team of 2 are aiming to adjust a panoramic camera to provide a better view. The spacewalk is expected to take about 7 hours.
And our main stories again. UN nuclear experts arrive at the Zaporizhzhia power plant in Ukraine as renewed shelling threatens to disrupt the trip.
EU states meets their storage targets for gas 2 months ahead of schedule, offering some comfort amid the energy crisis.
And Beijing accuses Washington of a technology blockade after 2 of America's top chip makers are ordered to stop selling AI chips to China.
That's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.